Welcome to another 60 minutes of unscripted .NET entertainment. As doctors of .NET, we prescribe healthy choices in .NET. As doctors of funk, we lay down the boogie and play that funky music until we die. I'm your host, Cam Soper, with co-hosts Scott Addy and Cecil Phillip. And I would like to welcome today's guest, Irina Scurtu. Irina, can you please introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Irina Scurtu. I am a software architect from Romania, so far east. And today we're going to talk about how to version your API. I find it very interesting how the teams are not very, let's say, familiar with versioning.
Well, our guests, our viewers do too. Your last visit to the show was one of our most popular shows ever, and we've been looking forward to having you on again. On that note, let's do a checkup. What do we got, Scott?
We got GRPC, just the thing the doctor ordered to brighten your Monday, right? So what do we have here? GRPC, first of all, what is it? Why would you care? So GRPC is what I would say is an alternative to what Irina will cover today, which is REST and Web API and ASP.NET Core. The GRPC was added in ASP.NET Core 3.0. And it's more of an opinionated contract-first approach to developing APIs. Think back to WCF if you ever did that. Maybe you were doing contract-first development in there. It takes, again, that contract-first approach where you're defining, here are the methods I will offer in the service. Here's what the request looks like. Here's what the response looks like. And you're defining that contract using an interface description language called protobuf or protocol buffers. What we have here in this particular doc is a strategy and some guidance for versioning that type of a service. Of course, you always want to strive for some degree of backwards compatibility. However, as we know, that's not always possible when you're building out services. And the focus of this doc is it's saying when breaking changes are implemented in a gRPC service, a consumer must react to those changes in some way. And it's for this reason that a real sound versioning strategy should be adopted. What you'll find down below here in this non-breaking changes section and the sections that follow that are examples of things that would not be considered breaking changes. For example, if you were to add a new method to your underlying protobuf file, that typically wouldn't be considered a breaking change. I guess the meat of this and what we wanted to focus on in this segment is the actual versioning approach, and you'll find that in the version number services section here. So it's real easy, actually. In your protobuf file, you'll have this optional package specifier, and that's the line that's highlighted here in green. Again, that'll be in your protobuf file, and it's that specifier's value that will be used as the namespace in the generated .NET code. The idea here is you would increment this version number v1 to say v2 each time a breaking change is introduced into the gRPC service. Now in this example, what we're doing is we're creating a greeter service. This greeter service will contain a say hello method that accepts a request object called hello request and sends back a hello reply object. Both of those objects are defined down below. Again, this is the contract first development approach. As always, dry, don't repeat yourself. That principle is of utmost importance here. You will want to consider moving your core business logic to a centralized location to avoid duplicating that across versions of the services. So that's the gist of this doc. If that interests you, we will flash up a banner here. So across the bottom of your screen, you will see this Akka link. It's just a vanity URL. You can go there and get access to this particular doc that I'm showcasing today. We also have some very exciting news for viewers tuning in today. And I'll put up another banner here for you. If you are interested in developing ASP.NET Core content, like what you're seeing here for docs.microsoft.com, And if you would like to work with Cam Soper on potentially Microsoft Learn content for ASP.NET Core, check out this job posting, aka.ms/ASP.NET-content-job. Again, an opportunity to really make an impact and show developers all over the world how to use ASP.NET Core effectively.
Well, and we just need to be clear. You don't have to work with me. I mean, you would be on the same team as me, but I mean, working with me is not a requirement of the job.
Yeah, that's a good point. I should say you should be willing to tolerate Cam Soper.
Much better. Much better.
How's that?
Thank you. I appreciate that distinction.
With that, why don't we roll into the hallway track?
Let's do it. As soon as I not have my tools ready to, to roll it. Oh, you had to distract me by talking about the job opening.
Sorry, Cam. It is Monday.
So, Irina, you're going to be telling us today about versioning REST APIs.
Yep.
So why don't you set the stage for us and give us a little context and tell us more about what you're going to be telling us?
Okay, so as in my job as software architect, I've worked with many teams, and I also remember back in the days when I started developing APIs. Let's call them REST APIs. When I learned the concept REST, I don't know, maybe 12 years ago or something, I found it very, let's say, complicated. And until I evolved a bit, I wasn't able to tell, okay, what's REST and why REST is helpful for a specific API. And once I started working with Web API, I realized that, well, some concepts in REST are easier to apply and some are not. But at least the ones that are easy to apply, maybe we should apply them. I mean, I've seen so many APIs with V1 in URL. The company closed, the API evolved too many times, but V1 was there. And in fact, a real REST API should be evolvable, and you should increase that version number every time you actually modify something in your API. What means to modify something? I don't know. Maybe when you remove a field or add something, or I don't know, change the behavior of the API, you should increase the version if you have it. But it's somehow common understanding that whenever you click a new project and create a new web API, you go there and add a V1 and let that V1 there. And I don't know why people are still doing this. I also did it. I must admit, I also did it.
I would say my take on this is what I've observed in the wild is versioning APIs is more often than not an afterthought. It's a lot like security. You know it's important, but as a developer, it's not the most exciting thing that's in front of you that you're being asked to do. And for that reason, it's often kicked down the road.
True, might be a reason, or another reason I think is the lack of documentation or the lack of something that is there, like in docs, have everything all together in there, because we have tools, we have everything, but they're scattered over everywhere, and we just cannot gather them in a pile and say, hey, to version, you need to read this and take that from here.
Yeah, I was wondering, when you version your APIs, do you think the versioning is usually tied to your code version? You know what I mean? So like for me, like I know when you version your code, like your DLLs and your methods and things of that nature, right? Like particularly in .NET, like there's a version in your MS build file or something of that nature. As I'm like updating my code and fixing things and making changes there, is there some mapping between things I do in my code and like the way I version my API?
It depends on the business domain that you have. If you have an API that you expose publicly and you have consumers and you do not know who are your consumers, you need to take care of breaking your consumers. So once you expose a V1 and then you think, hey, I will expose a V2 in a certain timeline, maybe you should think about, okay, I don't own the consumers of my API. I cannot force them to upgrade. So you need to think about a way of somehow making them to upgrade to switch to the next version. So it's not necessarily related to the build number for that specific API. It's more about the business case. This is how I'm seeing it.
Yeah, and I know a lot of folks have different opinions about how code should get versioned. Like I know some folks put like the year in the build number, for instance, or some people just do a semantic versioning where it's like three numbers with a decimal place in between or something like that. But I think with APIs too, the versioning is usually a little bit more like easier, right? It's usually just a V1 or V2 or 1.1 or something like that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Or you increase the minor version, V1.1 or something like that.
Right.
But you shouldn't do it too often because it will imply that you'll annoy your consumers. Hey, this is 0.1, tomorrow is 0.3, and so on and so forth. And it's annoying for them and impossible to catch up, actually.
Yeah. I think there's also a lack of agreement on the best approach for versioning. For example, do I send a request header with the version number? Or do I create a dedicated controller for each version? Just lack of agreement there.
True, but even so, I think we should avoid anything that changes the URL entirely. I mean, if you add it in header, okay. If you add it in query string, fine. If you add it in the accept header, also fine. But if you add it in the URL path as a segment and you force your consumers to change altogether, then it's not fine. Because the inventor of REST said that, hey, cool URIs don't change. I mean,
right.
And we should strive to have cool URIs to identify our resources, no matter what are those resources.
Right. And I wanted to get your opinion on this because I'm glad you mentioned that. So I've spoken to some like Restafarians or whatever we call it, people that like REST in the community.
Restafarian, I like that term.
Have you never heard that?
I've never heard that.
I've heard of folks that are really into REST, and when it comes to versioning, it's like what constitutes a version, right? And when I say that, sometimes you'll see folks version the content type, you know what I mean, which is different from versioning the actual like method calls that are available or things of that nature. So I feel like even within an API, like there's different things that can get versioned. You know what I mean? There's the methods that are available. There's the content that it returns. You know what I mean? Or, I don't know. Maybe you might have a version that specifies like the SKU or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but even so, there is a fine degree when we're talking about resources and methods. And in REST, we are working with representations of resources. And if tomorrow there is another representation of the same resource we were working with today, then you might think about maybe not a version, maybe a MIME type, a different MIME type.
Yeah.
And then it's easier. You can keep those together. So it's a delicate subject, versioning. When do you version? So basically, it's up to you, up to the business, up to the domain you're working with. Think about, I don't know, GitHub. How cool would be for them to simply change their endpoints out of a sudden daily or whenever they integrate something. Or in Azure.
So I just want to call out our co-host David Pine here has said that he versions his APIs API/v2/beer and Bratz /get all. And it kicked off a whole discussion about whether or not beer and Bratz should be different endpoints or whether they should be the same endpoint, at which, I'm kind of with Dave Brock on this. They should be different endpoints. But just to be clear, the V2 in the URI, that you're saying we shouldn't do that.
We shouldn't do that because it's a segment in the endpoint. And if you want to increase that, you'll force all your consumers to be aware of that. Hey, you need to add V3 in there, and it's not cool. And also, what is not cool in that endpoint is the get all, because REST should have meaning, and the meaning can be added by using verbs, the proper ones, headers. You should specify.
Because
in the URL.
why reinvent what the HTTP protocol is already defined?
Exactly. And remember, if you look at this URL, you might have a glimpse of a soap. I do not want soap in my APIs.
I feel like Dave's getting like a API review right here on
No, I agree with Irina on that. That get all segment in the URL gives me nightmares. I would prefer to see the ending segment be some sort of a noun, like beer and Bratz. And as Irina said, use the HTTP action verb to, take on the meaning of what you're intending to do with that endpoint, fetch or get.
Exactly. But I've seen this done in different teams in big projects. It seems easier for them to just add a new endpoint like /new something, create something, instead of using the verb. They're using also the verb, but they somehow prefer to have a new endpoint. And imagine how big of an API you can get with all the operation, with new, get all something, and so on and so forth. You would need a proper documentation for those just to keep track of the endpoint.
Yeah, and I guess with that being the case now, so if I have a singular URL, right, that has no version in it, like the versioning would be happening inside of the HTTP metadata. And if it happens in that point, essentially we have one address that's serving up multiple versions of an API, right? Like one singular address with n number of different versions, right?
Yeah.
And so now, if that's the case, I'm kind of wondering, how do you look at deprecating older versions, or do we just keep the whole versions forever? You know what I mean? Like, how do we, I guess, announce or message to our consumers, hey, well, this version is going to go away, you should upgrade to the new one? And then even from a routing and maintenance perspective in the backend, like how do we properly manage those different versions inside of your code?
So managing two different versions inside of your code in .NET is very easy. You can have two controllers with whatever name do you want. They respond to the same route, and it's easy. And also, by using a library, you can mark your endpoints as being deprecated, and you can announce this thing through a header to your consumers. But your consumers kind of need to look after that header property to see if a specific version is deprecated and what versions are supported. You can announce this.
Well, to that point, to that specific point, we had a viewer with a question. What happens when client apps don't pay any attention to the version, and like you've got this, these static URIs that don't change, but you're still versioning the API behind them? What happens when the API changes but the clients don't? Is there anything you can do to mitigate that, or?
Yes, you can, but you cannot prevent the clients from failing. It depends on the change that you're having, because you can treat a version as being the default one. So let's say your consumers have V1, you decided to upgrade to V2, and you keep the two versions in parallel for a while. And then you say, hey, you kind of need to upgrade to V2 because you're going to break. And if your clients don't do that, then it's up to them. I mean, there's out in the wild. I think these things should be somehow enforced, maybe in contracts, if you're talking about providing a service to some consumer. But you can also force the V2 to be treated as the default. Even if they ask for V1, you can shove to them V2. And
Gotcha.
Then a degree of, let's say, failing might be prevented. But it depends on what changes you have in the API. If you have completely new fields, then you have no other way than to let them fail.
So hypothetically, if I had like a public API and there is a given client out there, and I had nothing to do with implementing that client, somebody else implemented that client, and they're not asking for the right version number. They didn't implement it right, but they're failing. I can tell that they're failing left and right because they've implemented the wrong version. So I could maybe look at the request header then and like determine, oh, well, this is coming from such and such client that implements my code badly, implements my API badly, and I could like just for that specific client force them to whatever version of the API that I need to, right?
Yeah, theoretically you can do that, but you have the option of setting this globally. I mean, if any client requests something that is less than whatever version, serve them the whatever version you're currently at. So you can totally ignore any version that is less than. It's up to you how you do that. But well, you need a way of identifying that specific client.
Right.
If you do not have that mechanism in place, then you need to force everyone to move to the new version.
So Irina, I think in the pre-show, you mentioned there was some code that we could show the viewers to sort of demonstrate how you would approach this. Maybe it's the appropriate time to do that. I'm getting the sense that the viewers want to see some code now.
Yeah.
Specifically, the viewer that said "talk is cheap." Show me the code.
Okay. So I shared my screen. I hope the screen. Okay.
Yep,
awesome.
we got it.
Cool. I apologize because I'm using different tools and my CPU is spiking for whatever reason. So I'm gonna show you in Visual Studio, and I'm gonna build in the console, if that's fine. Trying to prevent any crashes. So what I want to show you is a small and awesome package. It's called Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC versioning. And the version there, that's the 5.0 for .NET 5. That is the magic package that allows you to version any way that you want a specific web API that you're currently developing. How it does that? Well, very easy, just by adding something in Startup, a middleware that is called Add API Versioning. And then when you add this middleware, it's up to you where and how you version and what's the name of the versioning parameter and so on and so forth. So I also have here a few controllers that I want to show you. So I have here 3 versions. I have Tox controller that supposedly is V1, Tox V2, and V3. So this is what we're gonna have a look at. So Tox controller, the main one, it's versioned with 1.0. It's annotated with API version. This is an attribute that comes from that package that I showed you. I also marked this as being deprecated, and my consumers would want to look after a specific property in the headers. And also I have the route. The route can be changed. It's up to you how you create your routes. But for example, I have something here that is API. I want to add a specific version in the route because I want to show you also the variant that I'm not using in production. And then I have speakers, and then for each speakers, I have related entities. So speaker ID, and then I want to obtain the talks. So it's an hierarchical version. These are resources that I want to show, and this is the way I'm gonna just implement everything. So V1, Talks V2 controller does pretty much the same thing, but it is the second version, and it has the same route for the current example. And Talks V3 has the same route, but a different method that doesn't return an entity. Okay, so let's go back into the startup part, and I'm going to minimize this, and I'm going to say, hey, I need to version my API by using an URL segment API version reader, which means that everything that it's related to versioning will go in the URL. in the segment. Let's see if this is running. It's listening. And I have like this. So I'm going to try to maximize this. Fingers crossed. Okay. So how my endpoint will look like, it will be like this. So it's localhost because whatever, the API, and I want to specify the version in the URI, which is not cool because I already told you cool URIs don't change. And if I come here, I need to increase the version, make it a plus plus, then I will force my consumers to also update, which is not cool. So I'm gonna just create a request. And if my computer doesn't die, I will be able to get a response back with a JSON. It's a 200 OK. And I get back an array of objects with an ID, title, and description. Okay. It doesn't matter how many of these items I have, but I want us to look in the headers to see that I have a few things with the response, date, content type, server, transfer encoding, and so on. Just as a side note, the server part header should be hidden when you go in production. And you also see here that I send the accept header as being application JSON, which means that I, as a consumer, I want back application JSON, and that's it. Okay, let's see what's happening when I'm increasing the version. And I'm going to say, hey, I want the version 3.0. I changed the endpoint, which is not cool. But even so, you'll see that the result I'm getting is made of title and description for each item that I have in the collection. So it's a V2 of that specific resource. How did I obtain that? It's just by adding a DTO, because I never expose the data context through the controller. And I work with models. And I have something like this. I have talk v1 DTO that has 3 properties that I want to expose to my external consumers. And talk v2 DTO has only 2 properties. And this way, it's very easy for you to version things and to keep things separated. Because we also have things like automapper that helps us transform from one type to another. And it's super easy to work with. So in talks v2,
so can we back up and double click on that just a little bit? Is there a relationship between the name of the controller and the version? I'm not sure I see where the wiring up is happening.
Yeah, it is, because I added talks v2 controller. This is how I prefer to name those, even though I have the name in the name of the version name in the controller name. But it's easier for me to distinguish which is which.
Oh, well, and I think I see what I missed. I missed the API version attribute on the line right above it.
So if you do not add this, it will be considered somehow as a default. So every controller that you have that responds to a specific version should have an API version for its own version in there.
So while you're here, I do have a question on this API version attribute, and I suspect some viewers are wondering the same thing. Let's say I never have a need to version by minor version, it's always major version. And for that reason, maybe I want that API version attribute to say 2 instead of 2.0. Thoughts on that?
You can do that. If you think that you'll always increase the version number whenever you have a major change. Okay.
Is there ever a reason you've encountered where you would want to version by minor version instead of just major?
If the business changes very often, or the domain suffers a lot of or if the domain is not so stable, I mean, then you prefer to have 2.1, 2.3 or something like that. Then have a bigger breaking change, a change to have like, okay, 3, this is a major version, and treat it that way. But again, it's up to the business that you're working in and the domain. It's relative somehow.
Sure.
Not a best practice somewhere to say, hey, you should use this. As long as you version correctly, it's up to you how you
Yep.
use these numbers. For example, some use dates there, not only numbers. They add the year or something like that, and it's also fine.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is pick a strategy that works with for your team's needs and be consistent with that all throughout
Exactly.
the APIs you're designing.
Exactly.
Speaking of strategies, David Pine actually had an idea that struck me as a good idea. I'd like to know your thoughts on it. Would it make sense to scope the version of the models that correspond to an API with namespaces by like folder? Would it make sense to like have the DTOs organized by, in a V2 folder under the models folder, for example?
Sure thing. I just added the easiest way of creating things for the viewers from the viewer's perspective. For sure, you can have folders. You can version by namespaces. You can identify your models by namespaces and so on. It's up to you how you do it and how you find it easy to manage. But for the simple example that I have, V1 and V2, just to distinguish between them, also works. But indeed, it might be annoying to have the version in the name of the DTO, because the version, it's not from the domain. It's something outside of it. One cool thing, just to summarize this, one cool thing I've found out about naming the controllers like this, it's easier for juniors, for example, when they ramp up on the project, to say, okay, this is the second version, this is taking care of V2, and this is taking care of V1. And also for the controllers, you can also create folders and so on, and put everything like subdomains in your, you have V2 and you have the controllers and everything in there. You can also scope it like that.
So we do have a question from the viewers. And the question is, can you also version at the action method level? So you've been showing the controller level thus far.
Yeah, you can also do that. For example, I'm in the talks controller that takes care of version 1, because I annotated like that. But inside it, I have a method that can be mapped to the version 2. So whenever I will request this with the version 2, will be called, even if it resides inside V1's controller. So by adding this map to API version and give it the version, you can version the action.
So I'm guessing if you could do that, you probably could also version like a default version in your startup.cs file, I'm guessing. So instead of me having to add them to all the things, I'm guessing I could just say version this, right? And so now I wouldn't have to necessarily add those.
Yeah.
Again, assuming that that's what I wanted to do inside of my application.
Yeah, you can also do that. So somehow with this library, sky is the limit, as long as you know what are the building blocks of the limit.
Right.
Okay, so where were we? In here, with higher version specified. So I'm gonna go into the startup and say, okay, I've seen this, I know how it works, it's in the URL, and maybe I shouldn't version like that. How about changing everything and versioning the header? Because it's somehow hidden, it's not in the URL, and all my consumers that want to use the version can use it in the header. Okay, so I'm going to change this in Visual Studio, and I'm going to stop here and run again. So the parameters that I'm passing to these version readers are defaults to API dash version, but you can add everything you need in there. For example, maybe if you prefer to version with a V, and that's the parameter for your version. And you can add that. So let's see if you can add questions. You can ask me something to make the time pass. Please save me here. Okay, well.
We do have another question.
You
know, and this, let me find it here. So the deprecated info for an endpoint, where is that how does that surface in the response headers? What does that look like?
I will get to it somehow at the end, but I can also show it. For example, in here, this is a call, but you need to configure something in startup. For example, you have a version property in the header reported that's called API deprecated versions, and in here it specifies which version is deprecated. And also you can report what are the supported version of the APIs. For example, like, okay, I have this that is deprecated, it's TLDL, but treated as deprecated. And I currently have 2 and 3 as being side by side.
Now, when a request is made with 1.0, does the response come back with any kind of header that says, hey, this version is bad, you need to not use this in the future?
No, it comes with this header, and it's up to the consumer to say, okay, I'm gonna listen to that, and I'm gonna take the key, and I'm gonna reissue the request. But also you can respond with the higher version. Even if the consumer asks for 1, you can respond with the 2.0 version, and it's perfectly fine.
Okay.
Now, is that you've got 2 response headers there, both prefixed with API dash. I know some folks would prefer to prefix custom headers with the letter X dash. Is there a way to customize that, or is that just are those headers that you're defining yourself, or are those coming from the NuGet package that you're using?
These are coming from the NuGet package. This is how they decided to treat everything. Indeed, a while ago there was X dash something, but now apparently they have API dash supported version and API something. Yes, you can customize this, but to be honest, I didn't have a look on how you can do that. But for example, I'm gonna skip a bit, and I'm not gonna build again, but I'm gonna show you this just briefly. For example, add API versioning. It's another way of doing things. You can say, hey, treat the default API version as being the 2.0. So this is what your default is going to look. And then by setting up this flag report API version to true, you're going to obtain the two headers that are here. Without it, it won't be sent. Another thing that you can add, for example, assume default version when unspecified. So if a consumer issues a request towards you, you can say, hey, you have no version, you can send an error. Or if not, you can treat it as being your default one. So nothing present, send the default. And also you can have here the API version reader, as I did above. You can add your own parameters in there, and also you can provide your own errors in case something happens related to the API. So I'm assuming that, well, it might be something like this somewhere where you'll be able to add your formatter of API version selector. All here, there are a lot of interfaces that you can implement and add your own functionality. For example, header API version reader, you can go ahead and create your own. You can combine everything just by implementing API version reader. So sky is the limit. You can do everything you want there.
Yeah, I was just looking through the documentation really quickly. So it does look like you can customize the thing that reports the API version, the header that reports it, but the one that says deprecated API version, it doesn't look like you can change that one.
Oh, okay.
At least that's what I've looked like so far. I'm like digging through the docs as you're talking about it.
I think maybe we should dig through the GitHub repo. Might be a better place.
Yeah, well, when I said the doc, yeah, their docs wiki is on their GitHub repo.
Mm-hmm.
Is where it is.
I've often found it easier to identify one thing or another because there are so many things undocumented just by looking at the GitHub, the actual code, the actual package, and scouting through that. And
Yeah.
so
We've had a few questions come up in the chat about specifically about what does all this do to the Swagger? Does this complicate the Swagger at all?
Swagger, I didn't try. To be honest, I didn't try it yet with everything because I made some last minute changes. It should report everything, the headers and everything that you have in a real API. You should have also with the version, with the Swagger. It complicates things a bit, but the complicated part is the version, and it's up to
Right.
you where you add it. Required in header, required in query string, or in the URL segment.
Yeah, I think with the Swagger docs, you have to so if you just install the package, it won't automatically report the versions.
I think so.
I think Swagger supports this, at least Swashbuckle specifically supports this thing called Operation Filter. And if folks are familiar with what the Swagger UI looks like, at the top right side, there's usually like a drop down that has the name of the API, right? And so what you could do is you can add a filter that will loop through the available versions. And so when you hit that little drop down, then now you'd see the different ones that are in there. But I mean, it doesn't happen out of the box. You got to put in, I don't know, 4 or 5 lines of code to actually enable that feature.
But I think the more people will version the APIs properly, the more the community will contribute to these packages to have everything out of the box.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Okay, let's see. This is running. This is not running. In the header.
We do have another question that's come up a couple of times now as like a resurfacing theme. Folks have been asking about, is there any way to reuse how can we reuse previous actions from previous versions? How do we map those previous version actions onto the new version? Is that just like adding another attribute to like the existing method, or how does that work?
It should be. I didn't thought of that, but I think should be just like that. Map to API version. Let's see. I'm not gonna build this because it will take. Is this a version? It doesn't accept an array. No, I think you should add something like that. Map to API version shouldn't force you to have duplicated code,
Right.
Let's see if it accepts. No, it doesn't work because it needs to. Oh, it works.
Oh,
so that's how you do it.
Well, there we go.
Makes sense.
Yep. Randomly adding here.
And I see some folks in the chat were asking about OData or speaking about it a little bit. This package supports OData, I'm guessing, right? To some extent.
Not to my knowledge. I think it's only for the
plain old web APIs.
No, I'm lying. Because I've seen in their GitHub repo they also have OData in the same package.
OData support. Okay. Yeah, I'm curious. I'm most curious when the OData conversation comes up, because I always want to know what people are actually using OData for, and like what are some of their scenarios.
I think should be a separate talk with OData.
Yeah, we should talk about it another day. It's just, again, it was popping up in the chat. I was like, oh look, there's OData folks here.
I'm curious myself. So, if you don't mind, folks out there that are using OData, if you could just drop something in chat that briefly describes your use case for it, that would be super helpful to us.
Okay. I mean, for OData, it's a good practice to use it if you do not have any other tools. I mean, that's why GraphQL, for example, is gaining so much traction, and people are starting to use GraphQL even though they don't have the right scenario for it, because they can't ignore OData. Whenever we're exposing collections, we should have filters and we should give page results. Imagine what would happen with an API that's exposing 1 million records with each request. It wouldn't be cool. So OData, I think it's a very powerful tool to use with the REST API. It will allow you a lot of things like filtering through that data, paging, everything out of the box. with .NET.
For our viewers that might not be familiar, and I'm looking to anybody here on the panel, Irina, Scott, or Cecil, can somebody give a little background on what OData is? When we refer to OData, what are we talking about?
Sure, I could talk about it super quick. So OData is pretty much like a set of conventions, at least I consider it to be a set of conventions that allow you to do some really interesting things with your web APIs, like paging, sorting, filtering. A lot of those things that you want to do when you're working with data, right? But instead of having that only happen on the back end of your API, now it gives like the client side some ability to have some of those querying capabilities. You know what I mean?
So again, so it kind of defines like a standard interface for querying and traversing through records, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. So if you're familiar with like the EDMX file that we used to have in Entity Framework a while ago, that's probably a bad thing for me to say. But if you remember the EDMX file, when you're designing it, right, like you can create these relationships, right? Pretty much like your data model relationships, right? And Entity Framework will hence, generate stuff based on that. Well, OData had something similar. There wasn't a designer, but essentially, like you create what your model looks like, right? Like what did the relationships between these things look like? So now, as you're making a query, you could say, hey, I want the customer and the customer address, or I want to go into the customer's address and get just the city and then the record number. So now you could create like these queries, right? It's like you're writing SQL in the URL almost.
And I was just about to say it's basically SQL for REST APIs.
Yeah, so it enables that type of functionality for for your web APIs.
The use case I expected to see did make an appearance in the chat. So for custom data export and reporting, that's where I've seen it used. Other places I've worked.
Yeah, and I think the OData folks just released a version 8 or something like that. I think it's RC. I think it's like RC version 8 RC for their version that's going to be working on .NET 5 /
Actually,
.NET 6.
OData is a standard, right? I think they're working on standardizing it as a.
I think it's Oasis. I think it's an Oasis standard. But in terms of like the .NET package, then the OData could be in any language. But I think for the .NET package, I think they just released a new version like the other day.
Okay, so it sounds like this probably doesn't work with OData. What else did we want to share about versioning and APIs?
The fact that we can version through accept header, and for whatever reason, the build is super slow, but I'm gonna show it anyways. So you can version in the URL segment, which is everybody does that. You can version it in the query string, like this query string. You can have a question mark and then the query string parameter, and then you add the version in there. The API will take care of identifying, okay, what's the API version and how it will reach through your routes. You can also have version side by side because that's the whole point, right? You can also have things that are version neutral, like maybe you don't need a version for something that, I don't know, takes care of your health check in the API. And one example is this, like ping controller. It receives a parameter and returns a pong back. You can add the API version neutral on your controller, and everything that is in there will be not versioned, pretty much, because maybe not everything should be versioned inside an API. And the fourth thing, it's a combination of header versus media types. So this is new. They included media type API version reader in the 5.0 version of their library. Basically, this media type API version reader will allow you to send with your accept header a version, and it will look like this. So when you issue the request, you'll have application JSON. This is basic. Everyone does that. you accept as a customer application JSON. And then you can add, hey, I want application JSON, but I want the v3.0 of that. So this is another way of versioning it. And how you do that is just by adding API versioning and media type version reader in there. But in your controllers, and I'm going to go to v3 that takes care especially of this, you should add API version 3.0 and combine it with a produces attribute, because it needs to distinguish, okay, it's an application JSON, but it's somehow a different type of application JSON, the v2 of it. So you need to tell it in here what it produces. Or not on the controller, you can add it in here at the action level. Okay. Pretty much this is one of the newest things that I wanted to talk about. So you just specify in here as the version. It's somehow very, very hidden. It's not that obvious. It's not a separate parameter, and you would have to look and know what the accept header does from the client's perspective. And also, with this, you would need to specify something in the startup. You would need to make your API listen to what your browser or Postman is sending. And you will need to configure this in your add controllers. This one, respect browser accept header, because otherwise, Web API is made to respond and treat JSON, and that's it. You ask for XML, cool. It will get you back application JSON because this is how it's meant to be. So once you add this flag to true, Web API, your Web API will know to listen to the accept header and actually have a look at it.
So just to back up, because I didn't know that. That's new information for me. So any request that I make to Web API, even though I put in the accept header that I want XML, unless I have this respect browser accept header option specified, it's going to give me back application JSON.
Yep.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And also, if you want XML, you would need to add something like that to make sure the server knows how to write XML in the response, like contract serializer formatter. Or if you have any other MIME type that is maybe custom made by you, you will need to add an output formatter that will help the server write in the format that you expect.
Great.
We do have docs out there on formatters. If this is something that is of interest to you, just go out to the official ASP.NET Core docs for Web API, and you'll find that topic.
For whatever reason, the API is showing as not found. The demo gods have failed me today.
Yeah, it always happens. You did something to anger them. You should sacrifice a chicken or something, and they'll be happy again.
I should, but I will also. You can find this example in a branch in my GitHub repository, so everyone can take that and run it. It also has this collection in there, so I'm pretty sure that it will work because it worked before the show. Why? And okay, I'm not gonna waste any time on it because I know it should work.
Well, should we look at the route real quick? Just
if you, now that you mention it, that might be it, because I only added to show this. And thank you for that. I added this to illustrate the versions in the URL segment. And it forced me to add that route to every other controller that I have. Okay, so this is the rough one that doesn't take any version in the URL segment, and that should be it. And that should do the job, actually.
Happy to help.
Thank you. So no need to sacrifice a chicken.
When in doubt, gotta check her out.
I'm gonna send one chicken to you.
I was going to say, back when I was a premier field engineer, sacrificing chickens was always a viable troubleshooting option, just so we're clear.
I know from now on.
But what would the Rastafarians say about sacrificing a chicken?
I don't know. We need to ask them.
They probably want you to sacrifice some code or something like that instead.
Yeah.
Burn a VM or something.
Yeah. Actually, that was a comment earlier in the conversation. Somebody had made made a comment to Irina about you hadn't sacrificed the
Azure VM.
The Azure VM. Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah. True. One thing I want to mention here before I forget. That's good.
That you use the post verb with that.
No, I did try.
I love it. I love it.
Another thing that I want to mention here is about a way of combining all this crazy stuff about versioning. So you can specify as an API version reader a combination of everything that it crosses your mind. So you'll have API version reader, you have the combine method, and in the combine method, you can pass everything that might. So, okay, if you're not finding it in query string, maybe you should look in the header, and maybe you should look in the URL segment and so on. So you can add everything in here as a list. And this way you're assured everything will be read from the client.
So we're seeing in the chat that the Rastafarians would use the delete verb instead of the word sacrifice.
Indeed.
For that chicken sacrificial activity we were referencing. So we do have a couple of minutes left before the show ends. Were there any super important resources you wanted to share with the viewers? It's like GitHub repos or lessons learned?
No, it works. I want to show this. It works. I also have a blog that I'm trying to, where I'm trying to write things about REST. Your previous show with me that was about REST, I think it's a good resource for people to get to know.
We would agree. It is a great resource for people to get introduced.
And you can, they can always DM me on Twitter if they have questions, or I also answer on the on the YouTube's chat afterwards to every other comment and question. So they can reach out to me. I have no problem on answering to REST related questions.
Perfect. So we're winding down to the end of the hour. Let me think. What do we usually do at the end of the show? Oh, that's right. We introduce our next show. Who do we have next week? We have
Greg Cannon.
Greg Cannon. Yeah. So this is a show I've been looking forward to. Greg Cannon is a community member who reached out to me one day, and he's just like, "Cam, I got to show you this cool thing I did." And it is pretty cool. He built a little e-ink dashboard for his home automation system in .NET. So he's going to show us this e-ink dashboard thing he built. So that should be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to that. And with that, we are, I think, more or less at our time box. So thank you, everybody. And we will see you all next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.